Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles. The series of books and videos on American history is seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of James Monroe, and the focus is retirement and legacy. The year is 1824, and Monroe is coming to the end of his second term. He's about to pass along the presidency to John Quincy Adams, and he's feeling in a pretty good place. He thinks the country is in a good place, and his final message to Congress is somewhat of a valedictory address, in which he says, in part, the situation of the United States is in the highest degree prosperous and happy. There is no object which as a people we can desire, which we do not possess, or which is not within our reach. From the present prosperous and happy state, I derive a gratification which I cannot express. So a happy moment for James Monroe to go off into the sunset and begin his retirement just shy of his 67th birthday, handing things over to Secretary of State Adams, again, who had been involved in a really contentious election with Andrew Jackson. It was decided in the House of Representatives, and as far as Monroe is concerned, he's ready to move on and move to their new retirement home in Loudoun County, Virginia, that they called Oak Hill. Began a pretty involved retirement for James Monroe. He had a lot of things going on, including his work with his friends Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Their project was a new university. This was led by Jefferson, but Madison and Monroe were both supporters of the University of Virginia and the founding in Charlottesville that finally turned on, and they opened up for business in 1825. Monroe and Madison are part of the Board of Visitors, and they're very proud to support their friend Thomas Jefferson in reaching this landmark occasion. Monroe also had plenty of time on his hands to think about the topic of slavery, which was a topic that his record was similar to many of the founding fathers, which in most cases is not very good. He had slaves his whole life. He relied on them for economic subsistence. He did nothing to diminish the practice of slavery on his own, either in his lifetime or in his will. And yet, like others of the founding generation, he abhorred it. He talked openly against the concept of slavery, but he didn't do much to get rid of it during his political career or his personal time. In his retirement years, he focused on a new way to perhaps deal with the two races, because he believed, like Jefferson and like Madison, that eventually blacks would be freed in the United States. They also all believed that blacks and whites would not be able to live together. There was too much bad blood, too much history between the races to be able to then actually come together. And so they believed, Madison and Monroe in particular, that colonization, the American Colonization Society, in fact, was the right answer. To be able to take freed blacks, send them somewhere, in their mind preferably to somewhere in Africa, where they could sort of start anew and not have the mixing of the races in the United States. And so the Colonization Society had a little bit of momentum, but frankly, it didn't go very far. There were a little over 4,000 blacks who were eventually transitioned to Liberia, which again was a relatively small number, and frankly, it didn't go very well because of the changing climate. They actually caught a number of diseases, and about half that population died relatively quickly. So it wasn't a very successful venture, and Monroe didn't get a lot of credit for it in the United States, but interestingly, he did get credit in Liberia, where they actually renamed the capital of Liberia Monrovia after James Monroe. He's the only U.S. president who's ever had a foreign capital named for him. But again, all in all, not a very good record for James Monroe, either personally or politically, when it came to slavery. Now, Monroe largely tried to stay out of politics. That wasn't all that easy, because they kept trying to bring him back in. And in the contentious election of 1828, which was a rematch between Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams, Monroe simply said, I'm out of this. He claimed, having held in the office from which I lately retired, a very friendly relation with both the candidates, and given to each strong proofs of confidence and regard, it would be very repugnant to my feelings to take the part of either against or the other. Those who have held the office of Chief Magistrate should abstain after their retirement from becoming partisans in subsequent elections to that office. In other words, leave me out of this. It was a contentious election. Jackson actually won it pretty easily. And Monroe would have to deal with Jackson on other issues in the public as part of the negative side of his retirement. But again, we covered that largely in a previous episode, not to be repeated here. The other part that, though, Monroe really did struggle in his retirement was financial. He was going broke. And again, this was not all that different from a number of other early presidents. There was no pension system, and frankly, they didn't make a lot of money during their long careers in public service. And their private station, in these cases, people like Jefferson and Madison and Monroe, they relied on their plantations, which frankly weren't enough to cover their costs in their professional career, where they spent a lot of money in service of their country. And the difference between Monroe and the others, though, is he wasn't simply going to take it lying down. He didn't want to just go into debt, leave that off to his heirs when he felt he was due money. And what was he due? He was due expense reimbursement, in his mind, for services from actually decades before, when he was overseas as a diplomat in France and in England, where to keep up with all the other diplomats, he needed to spend for where he stayed, giving parties, other social commitments, his clothing. If he wanted to look the part, act the part, be the part of a diplomat abroad in Europe, this was expensive, and his remuneration from the U.S. federal government simply didn't cover those costs. So he paid out of his own pocket. And you know what? Now he wanted reimbursement. He had never applied for reimbursement before, but his situation was such that he needed it. At the end of his presidency, he actually said to a friend, Fulwar Skipwith, that the present office found me in this state from which no saving that I can make will rescue me. I shall owe much more money in my retirement, and my object now is to make such an arrangement of my affairs as will afford me the greatest aid and relief that may be practicable. In this case, he wanted reimbursement for those expenses over in Europe from many years before. Well, Congress took this under consideration, and they thought, by and large, they would give him something. Not all of what he asked for. He asked for $23,000 in direct costs and another $30,000 in interest. It's a lot of money, over $50,000 he was asking for. Congress came back and said, you know what? He deserves something for these expenses. We'll give him 30 grand, roughly $30,000. John Quincy Adams signed the bill into law, and the money went to Monroe, which immediately went to his creditors. The problem was it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough for two things. Number one, to cover his debts, and number two, it wasn't enough for what Monroe thought he was due. He wanted it all. And so for the last 5 years of his life, he was constantly writing congressmen, trying to urge them to pass another bill to pay him back for those expenses that he took out of pocket in Europe. And nobody really wants this topic. It bounces around from committee to committee, from Congress to Congress, from year to year. Monroe is dying. It's 1831, and finally Congress comes through. They authorize another payment of roughly $30,000. This time it's President Andrew Jackson who signs it into law. And just a couple of months before he dies, James Monroe gets these additional funds to help again defray some of his debts. Boy, it was a lot of his time in his retirement was going after this money, but in the end, he actually came away with it, which was certainly helpful to his heirs. In terms of passing, it was Monroe's wife, Elizabeth, who passed first in 1830. And she had been with him really his entire life as his constant companion. Wherever he traveled, whether it was overseas or to the nation's capital, she was there with him. Now, she was ill a lot of the times, but in terms of their own household, she was very much a part of it, very supportive of his career. He counted and relied upon her, and he was really distraught when she passed. In fact, their friend, Judge E.R. Watson, said at the time that I shall never forget the touching grief manifested by the old man on the morning after Mrs. Monroe's death, when he sent for me to go to his room, and with trembling frame and streaming eyes he spoke of the long years they had spent happily together, and expressed in strong terms his conviction that he would soon follow her. And in fact, he did. It was just the following year that Monroe passed in 1831, and he picked up another post-presidential tradition along with Presidents 2 and 3, Adams and Jefferson. He died on the nation's birthday, July 4th of 1831. It was a momentous life for James Monroe. He had been a war hero as a teenager. He had been a congressman, a senator, a governor, a diplomat, Secretary of State, Secretary of War during war, and of course he had been President of the United States for 8 years. He was instrumentally involved in a number of key things, like the Louisiana Purchase, where he served as the negotiating minister. In the War of 1812, he was Secretary of State, acting Secretary of War. As president, he oversaw the era of good feelings. He acquired the Floridas. He oversaw and signed into law the Missouri Compromise, which at least put off the issue of slavery for another couple of decades when it would come back again, but still, still a major accomplishment for the time being. And in his second term, he issued the doctrine that bears his name, which basically told Europe, you stay out of the Americas, we'll stay out of Europe. And that pretty much held for most of the 19th century. So a pretty impressive legacy for one of the last of the founding fathers. Yet, James Monroe has almost completely been forgotten. There are no monuments to James Monroe. Only a handful of books have been written about him, including just a couple in the last 50 years. The question is, why? Why doesn't Monroe sort of get more recognition for all of those things that he had a hand in? And the answer is somewhat elusive. It's unclear why that is the case. Maybe it's because he was sort of in between the end of the founding generation and into the Jacksonian democracy, and so he was kind of lost in the middle. Perhaps it was because he was sort of a junior partner in a lot of these things, or more of a sidekick as opposed to the man in charge who would get the credit. You know, if you look at some of these things, Louisiana Purchase, he negotiated it, but Jefferson got the credit. War of 1812, Monroe played a key role in the cabinet, but clearly it was Mr. Madison's war. James Madison was the president. And even in his own presidency, John Quincy Adams sort of gets some credit for things like acquiring Florida and the Monroe Doctrine, which he was a major catalyst behind. And so some other names are associated with a lot of the things that certainly were prominent in the life and career of James Monroe. But all of this is somewhat of a shame because James Monroe was a credit to his state. He was a credit to his nation. He was a credit to posterity for the United States of America. He really deserves commendation, and it is a long time in coming. It is due. He owes it, and that's what we owe him as part of his legacy. That is James Monroe, Retirement and Legacy from the Life of James Monroe. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.